Hello, everybody. I'm David Bong, and I'm here with Howard Snyder. And the title of today's session is The Language Journey of a Tokyo Private Eye. So Howard and I had the opportunity to work in Tokyo in the early 90s for the leading investigative firm in the world. To me, this was my dream job. I got to use my language. I got to see the inside of what was going on inside Japan, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I couldn't have had a better experience. But I want to talk today a little bit about how we got there. So Howard, how did you start studying Japanese? What inspired you to do that? And I know you not only have Japanese, but also Chinese. Talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, for whatever reason, back in college, I knew I wanted to study Chinese at that time. And I had a great professor who said, "Hey, China just opened up. Would you like to go there?" And this was back in 1980. And he said, "We'll send you to Middlebury College," which still, I think, has the best intensive language summer schools in the States. And I went and took my sophomore year in China, came back. That was at Bowdoin College, transferred to Columbia University, where I started studying Japanese. And again, I went to Middlebury that summer because I kind of believe that those intensive programs are the best and only way to study language. I mean, get it in there, just subject yourself to that intense experience because it's, with Spanish, you can kind of feel your way through. Que paso, mi amigo, a bit more. Chinese and Japanese take a bit more effort. And my first job out of college was at the 1985 World Expo in Tsukuba, Japan. And I was interviewed by a Japanese American gentleman who actually was one of MacArthur's interpreters after World War II. And he obviously you needed the language to get that job. And that got me to Japan. And after that, I had a very interesting career. Even before we started working together, David, in banking. I worked for a bank and then went back to grad school and then joined you in Japan in the early 90s.
And those all required language skills, right? That's what really got you into those positions, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, that's what differentiated me. I mean, especially in the mid 80s, I ended up working for Citibank. And in the 80s, when that was the famous bubble period in Japan, if a young kid could speak Japanese, he could get a job in finance. So that's what got me that job, and did that for a couple of years and thought, the money was nice. It was okay, but banking was a little boring. So I decided to go back to the States and get my master's at Johns Hopkins SAIS, School of Advanced International Studies. And I got a job when I was working there with Nihon Terebi, NTV, one of the major TV stations. And again, I thought I'd be just clipping newspaper clippings, but my bureau chief, although he, like many Japanese, he could read and write English very well, he didn't speak very well. So the next thing I knew, I was on literally the press plane following George Bush for like 2 years, went to the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor celebration, went out to Saudi Arabia for Desert Storm. And again, this was all because I could speak the language, because that gave people trust that I knew about the culture and gave them the trust to hire me.
Yeah, no, you've had a wonderful career, and language has just been so core to it. I mean, I was much more sort of accidental, I guess, in how I started Japanese. I took a survey history course on East Asian history and just got fascinated with Japan. It was back then, this was in the 60s and early 70s, and it was the little guy kind of making its way in the world and fighting against the big giants. And I just kind of related to that. And I just fell in love with Japan. So I took Japanese senior year in college at Wesleyan University. And to be honest, I wasn't a very good student, but I knew I wanted to do something in Japan. So I decided I was just going to save up some money. So I worked a couple of years just in restaurants after college to save money, and then went over to Japan and studied the language intensively there.
Did you have a school lined up before you went, or you just
Yeah, I went to Tokyo Nihongo Gakko, which is commonly called Naganuma. It's the oldest school of Japanese language in Shibuya, or in Japan, but it's in Shibuya, right next to Tokyo Gas. Still there, still humming away. I'm still in contact with my friends from that era from all over the world. That was one of the most exciting aspects of being in Japan as a Japanese student is I had friends from Europe. There was a guy from Nepal who was there because his family would take hikers up Mount Everest.
Oh, right.
And, he needed to learn Japanese. He didn't speak in English, and I sure didn't speak Nepali, so we had to speak in Japanese. And it was just a fascinating experience. So that was really how I ended up getting hooked on Japan and Japanese. And once you're there, you get a flavor for the country and the language. It was just I couldn't lose it. I was hooked.
And I just want to echo one thing there, David.
Yeah.
I still too have friends that I made from Middlebury and that intensive course, and when I was studying Japanese, that are still some of my lifelong friends. I mean, you
Right.
know several of them. So, that's a very big bonding experience. And I mean, that expat experience in a foreign country too is a pretty special experience because it's a pretty self-selected bunch of people who want some adventure, want to do something different. And so that's a big part of it also. You meet a lot of interesting people.
Fascinating people. And you're right. Those are still some of my closest friends today. But, there are challenges. It's not like you can just say, okay, I study Japanese, give me a job that's really interesting. I mean, you have to kind of fight for it. I mean, what were some of the challenges that you faced, Howard, as you moved through your career?
Well, I mean, I've been pretty lucky. This was kind of before the internet. And, most of my jobs were from a personal introduction. That's how I think we met. I went, after I graduated from grad school, I called up the company in New York and said, hey, I already have a ticket in my hand. I'm going to Asia. I want to meet your people over there because, you can't expect a company to spend thousands of dollars to send you over and give you housing and stuff. And so, I went and met our former illustrious boss, Erich Turl, who, unfortunately passed away about a year ago. But he was like the model. There was that one movie with Russell Crowe about a kidnap and ransom specialist in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And I met him. And within 5 days, he said, okay, you're hired. We need you to send you up to Tokyo with Bongs on. He needs a vacation. So I've been pretty lucky. But I wheel that back. I've been lucky because I have what I believe is called linguistic integrity, that I really can read and write contracts and of course, not a native speaker, but have a level that is a professional level. It's not kid Japanese. It's not cute Japanese. And so having that language with other skills and experience in business gave me that comparative advantage to be able to get these jobs.
Well, I think one of the things you said that was key was you had a ticket in your hand. You were going to go.
Oh, yeah, I bought that. Yeah.
You can't wait for people to just give you something. You have to make it yourself, make it happen. I mean, the barriers that I faced, like I said, I wasn't a great student of the language. And, I didn't have a whole lot of experience. So I kept being told, oh, you don't have enough experience. And I did anything I could to learn Japanese. So I was in San Francisco as a waiter at Udonya.
Right.
I learned Japanese waiting on Japanese customers in Japantown. I was a tour guide for Japanese tourists coming in on their honeymoons to San Francisco airport. That led to a job in Japan at a startup. So I worked for a couple of years at a Japanese startup. Everything was in Japanese. I was the only non-Japanese there. You had to learn phone Japanese. You had to learn, like you were saying, Howard, contract language, formal language. And that was the thing that really clinched it for me to be able to have a career in Japanese, was that hands-on, every day, all the time working in Japanese, taking the commuter train 2 hours each way, standing up. That's what did it. And then I came back to the States. I got a job at a sake company in California. Again, everything in the office was in Japanese. All the memos were written in Japanese. I was able to work with the Japanese staff and be that interface between Japan and the US. And through my tour guide experience, I was able to get connected to the company we ended up working for in Japan. They had a San Francisco office, and I knew a couple of people in that office I had met. and they needed somebody who could investigate a certain business industry in California. And I had experience and I had Japanese connections, so they brought me in to investigate. They liked what I did. They said, well, why don't you write a paper on how we can penetrate the Japanese market? Because this was that company at that time had a San Francisco office, a New York office, a London office, but that was it. And they were looking at how to get into Japan. So I wrote that. They said, well, why don't you do this? So they hired me, and then I traveled around the world selling our investigative services to Japanese clients, and eventually ended up setting up and running the Japanese branch in Tokyo and bringing you on, Howard. But even there, within the company, I faced resistance because there was, I think, skepticism that any American could speak Japanese well enough and understand the culture well enough to operate in it. Because as Americans, Japan oftentimes seems so foreign, so different. So I had to fight those internal battles. But eventually, I persuaded enough people that I could do it, that they gave me a chance. And we had a 1-year trial. We were able to get enough business in and brought you on, Howard, and the business took off. But there were always challenges.
Well, I think also, David, two things were working for both of us. I mean, number one, it was when Japan was at its highest peak, right, during the bubble time, and the economy was really going well. Mm-hmm. And then also, as a foreigner working in Japan, I mean, if I was trying to sell cars in Japan, that's a tough sell. But the Japanese, I think, have always had a tradition of using a foreign expert who has expertise different than they do. Right. I mean, in the Meiji Restoration, I mean, they went around the world and copied the English Navy and the German Army. And so in our investigative business, they knew that they didn't have that function in their society. So I think, if you find the right niche market, they will actually believe a foreigner sometimes more than their own. So we were lucky at being in a good position there, too.
Absolutely. And talking about some of the cases that we worked on, there were times when we work with Japanese companies and we work with their legal department, and they would bring us in sometimes to investigate problems they had within their own organizations. So it seemed kind of odd that they would hire non-Japanese to investigate a Japanese company, but because we were from outside of Japan, we were more trusted, because inside Japan, you never know who's connected to whom, what human connections, what organizational connections somebody might have. So strangely, being an outsider made it easier for us to penetrate the inside of some of these organizations and actually get work for them. We had a case of a big Japanese international corporation had somebody in their Australian office who they thought was taking bribes. And they hired us to go in and figure out what he was actually doing. Turned out he was. And so they ended up letting him go. And then sometimes language became a barrier or a problem for organizations. There was a large international company operating in Japan that had a problem. One of their employees, and they didn't know who, was blackmailing them, saying that he would release damaging information about the company if they didn't pay this person quite a bit of money. And so we had to go in and investigate. We eventually found out who it was. But what we realized was that he was not a criminal person by nature, but he was so frustrated and so angry by the structure in that organization, because the manager had come from overseas, didn't speak Japanese, didn't understand Japanese. So he surrounded himself with a little group of managers who spoke really good English. And they didn't have the best interests of that company at heart, as it turned out. So the people who were really good and dedicated were kind of pushed down. They were excluded from access to the management because they didn't speak English. And that was what bubbled up and caused that problem.
Well, that's it. Miscommunication or misunderstandings are the root cause of problems almost everywhere. And I think, people like us were hired both to help the head office understand what's going on in Japan and to explain what's going on to them, and also help Japanese deal with overseas. And ironically, I found it sometimes a lot more frustrating and harder to make the Americans in the head office understand what's going on in Japan than it was dealing with Japanese or Chinese, helping them understand what was going around in the world. And that's changing now because languages, culture, and I mean, we even see in Japan these days, the foreign minister wants now for the Olympics, instead of saying Shinzo Abe, right? And he's saying that from the Olympics, we want foreigners to pronounce Japanese names the way we do. So have the myoji, have the surname first. So Abe Shinzo. And just knowing which way is correct can give you credibility with people and also avoid problems. So this, especially America these days, right? I mean, people think everyone should speak English. Well, we're finding that in this world, and especially with the rise of China more than Japan even, that no, you have to deal with people on their own terms to really understand them, to give them face. And that's natural. I mean, you turn it around. Think of if a foreign executive came to America, couldn't speak any English. We would laugh if he tried to do business at the level that a lot of Americans or other foreigners do in Japan and China and all over the world. So I just think this is going to become, language is going to become more and more important, because if we're seeing that if you don't speak people's languages and understand their culture, it can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and hopefully not dangerous conflict, right?
Yep. And then I think because English is the international language, everybody speaks English, it's true. But when you're trying to operate in a culture, as you said, Howard, you have to really understand and speak that language. You just can't avoid it. I mean, there's the old Willy Brandt expression. He was the mayor of Berlin, and he said, "Sure, if I want to sell you something, I'll speak English. You want to sell me something, you better speak German."
Right.
And I think that's true. You talked about the difficulty, Howard, of persuading headquarters of what's going on in Japan or in China, and I think there's also something that happens in any organization. At headquarters, they become somewhat skeptical about what you are saying about Japan or about China, because they think, well, he's gone local. And that's an expression you hear, oh, they've gone local. In other words, they're thinking more in the mind of the local people than in the mind of the headquarters people. And that's the opportunity, but also the challenge, because they need that local understanding. And they need somebody who can interpret what's going on, who can understand and is sympathetic to what's going on in the local market. But there's always a bridge. And in our role, I just found that bridging of cultures so fascinating, so exciting. Whether it was bridging to headquarters or working, we had some cases where we worked for Japanese companies who had problems overseas. I remember one manufacturing company that had a significant problem in a country because they didn't pay attention to the local way of doing things. They just sort of bulldozed their way in and frankly didn't do a very good job of being good corporate citizens in that country. So they learned their lesson. And when they went into another country in Asia, they hired us to go and find out what the local culture valued, who the important people were to get to know, to learn from, so that they could operate as good corporate citizens. And we were able to provide all that information. And from what I've heard, they've been very successful in that operation. So, just the idea of reaching across barriers, cultural and linguistic barriers, is just endlessly fascinating.
And I think that bridge function, David. In one way, even 5-10 years ago, before social media was as popular as it was today, and information wasn't as available, if you walked on a tatami mat with your shoes on, it would be embarrassing and maybe, oh, he's just a foreigner. I mean, in today's world, there's no excuse for that anymore. You should, and so in that way, language and culture, it's a sign of respect for people that you respect them as a people and a culture and as a society. And the days of just being the dumb foreigner. Although, it's you can always pretend to be dumb and get away with things oh, wakarimasen, you don't understand. But again, if you're serious about doing things at a high level, whatever that means, but doing serious things, meaningful things, trying to get things done. Language and culture, it's just, I think, becoming more and more important as a lot of societies all around the world turn inward, and it's just important. And without the language, I mean, I look again professionally, almost every job I've ever had in China, Japan, I wouldn't have got them if I didn't have my language skills.
Yep.
And and these days it's not just language. You have to have some sort of technical or legal or economic background too, because there's so many people who have studied abroad and speak English now. So the language is important, but having experience and yeah, David, like you said, I mean, we all start out, we don't have experience. I mean, I remember going to Japan. I mean, one of the ways I remember learning English, I literally stood near a jido hambaiki, right? A vending machine that sold beer and sake. And I would try and talk to salary man who were drinking their beer before they went home, because it's like, okay, he's drinking. Hi, konnichiwa, watashi no namae. I talk to drunk people to get my language up. And, the premise there again is Japan, China, Asia. These are some of the safest countries in the world. In America, someone just going up to a stranger and talking could be dangerous. But over there, it was, henna gaiji, right? A strange foreigner, but it was totally acceptable and a great way to practice the language. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit next was what's some advice you and I might have to people who are coming up, who are thinking about careers, who are looking at how they can use their language in a career. What's aside from going up to a beer hambaiki, jido hambaiki, what would you recommend?
Well, I stressed taking an intensive course at Middlebury. I just think taking an intensive course or two, having some type of fundamental something to build on before you go is important. Because if you just go, I mean, you meet lots of people who didn't study a word, they spent years and just picked it up after years and years. But having some sort of basic grounding in grammar and some vocabulary and simple words will serve you a lot better than going without studying at all. That's number one. And do you need, I guess, I mean, I personally am very interested in the kanji characters and stuff. If you are going to be reading contracts, you have to become literate. But otherwise, if you just take even an intensive kind of conversational course just to get you going, that'll save you a lot of pain when you arrive in Narita Airport and have to ask where something is. So I just think getting as much studying in, and today you can do things on the internet and just buy the Lonely Planet Guide to Japanese, whatever. Just kind of have some basics down and use it, because people will be very happy and very complimentary to you, and it feels good in your ego when people say, Nihongo wa omae desu ne. Even if you can only say konnichiwa, they'll tell you how great your Japanese is. So get a little base and don't, and also you have to have a good sense of humor, because you're going to make mistakes. So you have to be able to laugh at yourself. And people are much more patient than here in America if someone's speaking poor English. So that works for you.
Yeah. Well, I took a very different path because, as I said, I was a pretty mediocre student of Japanese before I went over, and I only had 1 year. So when I got to Japan, I was really lost. And I just kind of figured it out as I went. But I went to school for 2 years in Japan. So I guess I agree. If I had had the chance to take an intensive course, that would have been fantastic. But I just didn't have that opportunity. But today, you're right. There are tools out there. You can go on the internet. You can find a conversation partner. On the internet, you don't have to go to Tokyo to experience that. But I guess my advice is, however you do it, live the language. Just dig in. Don't be afraid. I mean, there's nothing better to teach you about taking risks, about teaching you to be an entrepreneur and a businessman, for example, than learning a language, because it teaches you those risk-taking strategies. And just go for it. I mean, there's nothing you can't do if you fix your mind on it. I also think it's really important to learn to be literate, as you were saying, Howard. You know, the reading and the writing is really important, especially the reading. And these days, writing is a whole lot easier than it used to be, because you can just use the computer and it pops up the kanji you need for whatever you write. So that's important. Not just the speaking and the listening, but also the reading and writing are really critical if you want to have a career and really go far. So I don't know. Do you have any closing words? I wanted to ask you if you have any favorite expression in Chinese or Japanese that you'd like to share, or any closing words, Howard?
Well, Japan, shoganai, what can be done? That's used quite a bit. I mean, in our life in the investigative world, we got to use all of our knowledge and analytical skills, and from a good liberal arts education, to help people. I often say that life is neither black nor white; it's different shades of gray, and so we were able to help people understand what shade of gray they were dealing with, and there's value in that, and I think clients and people appreciated that. Like you said, I'm with you. Just go for it. Traveling is not only helps you learn about other languages and cultures, it also helps you learn more about your own country and the good and the bad. And I've spent a lot of time abroad, and it's given me a perspective on what's going on in America, what other opportunities there are in other places. And it's also, I mean, I've been lucky enough. I've worked at 2 Olympics. I've worked at the FIFA World Cup in Japan in 2002, and this was all because I spoke the language. So it opens doors to worlds that are yet to be explored, and good luck in the journey, and keep going, because it's a lifelong journey, never ends.
Indeed. Yeah, so I guess the expression I've always liked is naseba naru, naseneba narunu, nanigoto mo. So it's basically, if you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you won't. But it's more than that. It's almost, if you think something's possible, it'll happen. If you think you can do something, just go for it. And it may not turn out the way you expect it, but you'll get to someplace really exciting and really interesting. Language just takes us as far as we can ride it. So thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, let us know. And good luck on your journey.
Hai, gambatte kudasai.
Gambatte kudasai.
Hai, all right. Yoroshiku.
Bye.